Hey guys, today I'm talking about childhood emotional neglect. Recently I've had just a few clients that are amazing people, but they're battling overcoming childhood emotional neglect. And just when I think I've heard like the worst story ever that somebody's gone through in their childhood, somebody else comes along and it really makes me realize that there are some people that never deserved the right to be parents. But the problem with childhood emotional neglect is the fact that not only did it steal your childhood and ruin what happened to you when you were a child, but on top of it, most people that battle childhood emotional neglect continue to battle it in their adult life as well. And there's nothing worse than having not only your past or your childhood stolen from you, but your adult life as well. So I wanted to put this video together and share some tips that I often share with my face-to-face clients. So with that in mind, let's get started. So the first thing I want to mention is that childhood emotional neglect is on a spectrum, just like everything is on a spectrum. So sometimes it's very overt and it's very easy to talk about and validate the fact that you've had childhood emotional neglect if it is overt. What I find to be the case, though, with a lot of my clients is that their childhood emotional neglect was on a more covert scale by their parents, and that makes it a little bit harder to heal from, and I'm going to explain why. Okay, so first of all, what I mean by covert or flying under the radar is that maybe the parent never raised their voice. Maybe the parent never hit the child. Maybe the child had externally everything they needed. Food, clothing, shelter, all of that was taken care of very well. But on an emotional level, either the parent was absent, maybe they just provided the child with material things and wasn't there for their emotional needs. Sometimes on top of that, there was covert abuse. So for example, maybe the child begins to see that they're only accepted and loved if and when they're doing exactly what the parent says, whether it's their feelings, their thoughts, their actions, has to be exactly what that other parent wants. And whenever they're their authentic self, or they're showing any kind of autonomy or separate perspective from that parent, in a covert way, there's some kind of punishment. Maybe it's a look, maybe it's a frown, maybe it's the silent treatment. Maybe it's an air of being displeased. And as soon as that child conforms, then they're praised. On a subconscious level, what that is teaching the child is that it's not safe to be you. You're not allowed to be you. You have to do and be what I think you should do and be. So that's one end of the spectrum. Somewhere on the spectrum also is a parent that never mirrored properly their children. So kids learn how to love themselves, how to validate themselves through obviously unconditional love by their parents, but also through mirroring. So they feel seen and heard and cared about when their parents mirror them. Let's say the child is sad, right? Something happens and the child expresses his or her emotion. A healthy parent that mirrors properly will validate that child's feelings, even if they think there's no reason to have them. In other words, they allow that child to be who they are, to feel how they feel. And they teach the child that feelings are safe. Well, if you're in an unhealthy emotional environment, you're made to feel like your feelings aren't safe. There's no proper mirroring. In fact, there's always invalidation to your feelings. So if you're sad, you're told you have nothing to cry about, or I'll give you something to cry about. Or if you're happy, and this is where it gets confusing, because it's even with positive emotions that a malignant or toxic parent can invalidate that child. So if the child is happy, you think of a malignant narcissist who sees happiness as a threat because they can't feel it. So when they see someone feeling genuine happiness, it's like a mirror to their empty soul, that they can't feel that, so they have to stamp it out because it makes them feel better. So feelings like happiness, joy, excitement, passion also wind up getting taken away from a child if they're in an unhealthy emotional environment. So my point is there are different degrees of childhood emotional neglect, and everyone has to reflect on where they are or where they were on the spectrum. And it's about validating your inner child's perspective. In other words, if you really want to heal and you don't want that past to be destroying your present life and your relationships and your future, you have to validate that inner child's perspective, because maybe as the adult you are right now, maybe you can look at your childhood and realize, okay, well, other people had it worse. We tend to minimize it, right? And sometimes we do that because as the adult we are now, we can put it into perspective and we can understand it better. But the truth is that even if as the adult you are now, even if you understand it, if you don't heal the wounds, you're still carrying the thoughts and the feelings of your inner child. So if you haven't done any inner child work, your inner child doesn't feel the same way as you. There's your adult self's perspective and your inner child's perspective. And in order to heal, you have to validate and understand it from the perspective you had when you went through it. And when you're doing that inner work, that healing work, and I'm going to give you some tips that are really valuable, that really help, it's important to have empathy for that inner child. Sometimes my clients have a tremendous amount of empathy for their parent. And they'll tell me, Michele, I know that he or she did their best, and I know that, it wasn't on purpose in the cases of some parents that were just, they were absent, right? Maybe they were single parents, they love their children, but they weren't there emotionally for whatever reason. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to have that empathy. But with a lot of my clients, I find that they don't have that same empathy for themselves. In other words, they're still struggling to heal the childhood emotional neglect. And they get upset, angry at themselves. They criticize their healing progress because it's not going fast enough. They're very hard on themselves. Whereas a lot of times, not every client, but a lot of them will put a tremendous amount of empathy and understanding towards the parent. So again, that's a beautiful quality. It just has to be balanced with giving your inner child empathy as well. So the reason I bring up the scale is that regardless of whether or not your parents purposely hurt you because maybe they had addictions, maybe they had their own wounds that they never healed, so wounded people wound, right? Or maybe they had a malignant narcissistic personality where sadly there's a lot of manipulation and abuse, or whether they just were doing their best and didn't know how to be there for you emotionally. Regardless of the reason, if you felt unseen, unheard, and uncared about, then you have wounds from childhood emotional neglect. Okay, so like I said before, the first thing is to validate your perspective. Empathize with your inner child's perspective. So if you're wondering right now, if you're thinking, well, maybe I didn't have that, maybe I didn't go through childhood emotional neglect, maybe I'm healed, from the imperfections of my family, the normal dysfunctional imperfections, because pretty much every family is almost dysfunctional today. But if you're wondering if the healing could use some work, and in your case, you can ask yourself a few questions. The first question is, am I a people pleaser? It's usually an indication of someone that went through some kind of emotional neglect where they didn't feel accepted for being themselves, where they were taught they had to get somebody else's validation in order to feel good about themselves. That's one question you can ask yourself. Another question is, do I tend to focus a lot on how other people feel, what other people need, what other people are thinking, and there's a disconnect in myself, right? where I don't even think about how I feel about something. And there's a disconnect in yourself where you're not even reflecting or looking within as to what you think, what you feel, and what you need. And I'll never forget one client. He was working through people pleasing, and he was telling me about a date that he had gone on, and he was talking about how much he wondered if she liked him. And he's telling me all the thoughts that he had about, what she might be thinking. And I asked him, I said, "Did you like her?" And he said, "I was so busy trying to make sure she liked me that I didn't even reflect on that." So if you tend to reflect a lot on making sure you're liked and not reflecting on how you feel about somebody, that's something that could be, a remnant of emotional wounds from childhood. And so another way that you can kind of self-reflect and self-examine yourself is if you feel like you need validation in order to hold on to your perspective. So, for example, if you're going to make a decision, you need to ask a certain amount of people and hear the answer a certain amount of times before you trust yourself, right? Before you trust the decision. Or you have a view of something, and if somebody comes along and shares their view and it's opposing yours, you switch as if everyone else's thoughts and views are up here and yours are always here. So if you ever feel like that is something that you battle, that's something to look for as well. And the last thing that I'm going to say that could be an indication, and of course it's not an all-inclusive list, but something else that you can look for is your relationships. Do you tend to have either friendships or long-term intimate relationships with people where it's more one-sided, where you're the giver and they're the taker? Those are some clues to unhealed childhood wounds that kind of help us to see where we're at on our own personal healing journey. So now I want to give you some tips that have worked with myself and with a lot of people as well. The first step is to validate your past pain, okay? So that means whether it was intentional or not, if you had things happen to you that hurt you as a child, you have to validate that pain. And the way you could do that is if you think of the circumstances or memories, if there's certain memories that come up a lot and they're painful for you, right? Sometimes we have the tendency to play the memory through our mind as if our mind is like a radio and we're rewinding, play, rewind, play. And we're literally going through the memory all over again, feeling the same pains all over again. And then we're just kind of noticing it, but we're not really validating it. So just hitting rewind and play with the memories is only going to bring up the chemicals in your body that were the exact same chemical response that you had when those memories took place. So you're going to be either bringing up fear, anxiety, depression, resentment, hopelessness, helplessness, all of those negative emotions. But when you validate it, you stop that cycle. And you're stopping it and you're saying, okay, what did I feel as a child? Well, that made me feel pain, loneliness. I felt not enough. You call out the emotion when you validate it, and then you acknowledge the fact that you felt that way, that it wasn't fair, that you didn't deserve that. And that's the part that helps us to heal and let it go. Sometimes our feelings, they linger and they like bang on our soul because we're not acknowledging them. The toxic parent, if you had a toxic parent, didn't acknowledge your pain. And now as an adult, without realizing it, you've internalized that behavior and you don't acknowledge that pain. And just because you don't acknowledge it doesn't mean that it goes away. So to make it go away, you have to kind of feel it to heal it. You call out the emotion, you acknowledge its existence, you acknowledge how it affected you, and then you choose to let it go. And that's the process that helps us to break that pattern of just play, repeat, play, repeat. The second step that's really powerful is start noticing your feelings, right? Whenever you go out somewhere, The tendency with people that were raised in these environments is you're aware of what everyone else is thinking and feeling. And it only creates anxiety inside of you. But if you pause, every time you notice that your focus is external, pause and ask yourself, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? What do I need? How do I like this person? What's going on inside of me? The more you can check in with yourself, the more you're going to feel grounded inside. Any social anxiety that you have is going to subside because you're focusing on you, you're caring about you, and you're going to show up more authentically. And it's going to teach you how to be connected to self, okay? Because if you were raised in an environment where your thoughts and feelings went unseen, again, our tendency is to internalize that behavior, and now we're not seeing our thoughts and feelings, we're seeing everyone else's. We have to break that cycle. And when we do that and we're checking in with ourselves, then we are seeing, hearing, and caring about ourselves. Okay, and there's that self-connection. A lot of times if we were raised in an environment where our emotional needs weren't taken care of, and the truth is a child needs someone else to have their emotional needs taken care of, right? They can't do it themselves. They don't have the emotional maturity, they don't have the emotional literacy, and they shouldn't have to take care of their emotional needs when they're children. But if that didn't happen, sometimes we can fall into the process or the habit of expecting somebody else to fulfill those emotional needs. And unfortunately, if we stay in that habit, we'll wind up attracting or being attracted to toxic people. Okay? So the way you break that cycle is feeding your self-love, feeding your emotional needs with your own self-love and acceptance. And you do that by what you say to yourself. So pay attention to your inner dialogue. How healthy is it? How upbuilding is it? Are you telling yourself things that you would tell somebody else, somebody that you cared about? Do you treat yourself, or do you talk to yourself the way you talk to people that you love and care about? If you notice that your inner dialogue is harsh, it's mean, be willing to change it. It's the only way to heal is to do things differently. If we adopt the way the person that hurt us treated us, and now we're doing that to ourselves, we're only finishing the damage, right? They started it and now we're finishing it, and it's not a way to live. Once you realize that you have been a giver, right, and that you've had one-sided relationships, or you're the one in the family that does for everyone and no one does for you, start putting down boundaries. Now, in order to put down boundaries, you have to know what your boundaries are. So think about what feels good for you. How much do you want to give? What do you expect in a healthy relationship? What does a give and take relationship look like with the people in your life? And this is a hard step because sometimes it involves, when we put down boundaries, it involves cutting out people that are harmful, or having less time with people that don't respect boundaries. So it's a change in who we spend time with. But again, we can't change, we can't feel different, we can't feel better as if we're healing if we're not doing things differently, okay? And it kind of leads me into my last point, which is about healthy connections. Start forming healthy relationships. And if you do have some in your life, then spend more time with people that make you feel good instead of chasing the approval of people that refuse to give it to you. So those are a few tips. If working on all of them is too much, pick one. Pick one or two tips that you haven't tried or that you're not being consistent with, and start on a daily basis, doing little things that are in harmony with that tip, and you'll start to see tremendous change inside of yourself.